Hello, how's everyone doing today? Welcome to the 160th episode of Zilog and Moto. Well, 160th episode, assuming you don't count the year in review videos and other one-off videos. You know what, let me just start again. Hello, and welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and I hope you're ready to get your retro review on for the next 20 minutes or so, as I yet again go fishing in the English language library of the Sega Master System, Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, in hopes to reel in something nice like a swordfish, rather than some crappy umbrella. Seriously, Rugu Toku, who reels in an umbrella? Honestly. In all seriousness, if you're not familiar with the channel, and you enjoy Sega and retro gaming, I think you might enjoy this video. You see, at Zilog and Moto, I came up with the idea not just to collect all these games, but to review them. And then not just review them by booting them up in some crappy emulator and grabbing a minute of footage and calling it a day, but to actually look at the physical aspects of these games, including the manual and other things that might have come with them. But also do an in-depth review of the game, played with original hardware to try to get a 1992 experience, but with the benefit of modern niceties like retro tinks and 4K TVs. If that sounds interesting to you, I'd ask that you think about subscribing, as I try to release one of these videos once a week or so, and at around 160 episodes, however you count it, there's still a long ride ahead and plenty of games that I haven't even mentioned yet, much less reviewed. If you've been watching for a while and aren't aware of how I choose what games to play each week, I'll admit there is some randomness to it. There's some days when I pick games based on the things that are going on in the world right then, especially when it comes to sports. But then there's also days when I just flat out say, I think it would be a good idea to play this today, without any specific reason for it, just because I want to, and I think it fits the schedule well. But then there's also a third option. You see, one thing that you see a lot when covering these games on these four consoles is games that are part of a series. Well, when that happens, I like to do two things. To try to cover them in chronological order and space them out every 100 episodes apart, so that there's plenty of room to breathe in between, and it helps with a fresh viewpoint when doing the review. Today's review is one of the latter in that scenario, as I'm looking at Aerobiz Supersonic for the Genesis, the sequel to Aerobiz, which I looked at back in episode 59 of Season 2. If you're not familiar with the Aerobiz series, you might want to go give that video a look real quick, but in short, the Aerobiz series gets its name from exactly what the game is, which is an Airline Business Simulator from Koei. And if I'm not pronouncing Koei correctly, definitely let me know in the comments below so I know before I review another title from them. Aerobiz Supersonic was released in late 94, early 95 in the United States, and as you might expect with this being a later release, it's a bit on the rare side, selling complete right now for between $120 and $150. Which begs the question, is it selling for that price simply because it's not a common game to run across, or is it actually a good game, which is driving up its value as well, making it something that's truly sought after? Well, the only way to find out that answer is to play it, which is exactly what I'm going to do. But first, a look at the package. And this is Aerobiz Supersonic. I consider this copy of the game to be in really nice condition, at least on the outside. The clamshell is fully intact, with the hang tab still in place at the top of the case, and overall the outer cover is free from tearing and only minimal scratching is present. The inner cover looks sharp as well, with the colors just popping off the page, and there's no sun fading or water damage anywhere to be seen, just a box that looks pretty similar to how it would have looked on the shelf 27 years ago. The manual on the inside sadly isn't quite as pristine, but I'll get to that in a minute. The cover art itself is okay. This is a cut-down version of what was previously released on the Super Nintendo, and you can see that they had to crop the art to fit the vertical window on the Genesis format, and while you did get back a little at the top and the bottom, you can tell the art on the Super Nintendo cover is clearly how it was originally intended to look. I suppose it's fine if you don't know any better, but I definitely prefer the art from the original Aerobiz. Also, just for another thing to compare it to, here's the art from the Japanese version, that clearly has an anime basis. I don't love that Japanese cover, but I should point out that that art style is a bit more representative of what you'll see when actually playing the game. One last thing from the cover, I do like the "Lead your airline into the future" tagline. It's a simple but effective way to get you excited about a business game, with rather than leading an army of archers and knights into battle against other airlines, you're leading accountants and baggage handlers. Okay, so maybe that's not the best analogy, but I still like it. Flipping over to the back of the case, and there's that same tagline at the top, followed by some very nicely organized flavor text and screenshots. I know I've mentioned this before, but I really appreciate looking at some of these later releases and seeing how these designs advanced and got more complex, with a clear indication being that publishers had access to better quality layout tools. The text sells the game well, and I particularly like the bullet points that are actually red supersonic jets. Koei actually did something similar with the original Aerobiz, so it's nice to see them do that again. These little touches like that can mean a lot. The actual text of those bullet points do a good job of selling the main features of the game, and one in particular really intrigues me, where it states that the game allows you to explore 4 eras of aviation, including 2, quote, futuristic ones, which is a big upgrade from the previous game, which only had 2 eras, or scenarios, to play through. Over to the side are screenshots, and they're fine. Each shows a different portion of the game, which is always good. However, if there was only going to be 3, they really should have been bigger, and they're all widescreen formatted to fit the same size box as the barcode at the bottom, so I can't tell if they've been cropped or stretched to fit. Okay, well, maybe the layout isn't quite as good as I thought. Anyway, moving on to the inside, and you can see what I meant about the manual being a bit worn, and apparently scribbled on, at least for the cover. Thankfully, the inside is intact, and it's a big manual, as you might expect from a business sim, weighing in at about 60 pages total. The manual is laid out extremely well, with tons of helpful diagrams and graphics from the game explaining all the different options, and it includes information about all the cities that you'll potentially set up shop at. And then possibly my favorite part, the chart of all the airplanes available to you. So many airplanes. Also, in case you're wondering, there was a poster included with the game originally as well, just like the original Aerobiz, but it's pretty hard to come by these days, so I opted for just a copy with the manual only. Okay, well that's the package. Let's do some business supersonic style, and try not to crash and burn. Before I get too into the game, if you aren't familiar with the series or didn't see my video on the original Aerobiz, you might be thinking, Airline Business Simulator? That's an awful weird category of game. And you'd be right, it's definitely not the most common style of game in the world. But Koei, famous for their strategy games at the time, really leaned into the genre and actually had a whole executive series of games that the Aerobiz series falls under. Along with the Aerobiz games, Koei also produced the Top Management series, which was electronics industry focused, and Leading Company, which was more focused on the VCR industry specifically. And if you thought, simulator games, don't those make more sense to be on a home computer rather than a console? Well, you'd be correct, as all of these 3 series have had releases on various Japanese home computers, along with the console releases for the Genesis and Super Nintendo. This line of thinking was what I led into the review of the original Aerobiz with, as I simply didn't understand how a game based around running an airline would even work, much less how it could be any fun. I mean, I've always enjoyed flying. Like most other people, I haven't done much flying the last few years due to COVID, but I'm definitely looking forward to getting back out there and experiencing new and different things. For instance, in a few months I'll be flying into Jacksonville for the first time, so I'm curious to see how their airport is different and what that trip will be like. Sure, air travel can be stressful, but when things aren't too disastrous, it can be a good kind of stress, filled with the excitement of experiencing new and different things. This affinity for air travel is part of why I picked up Aerobiz to begin with. Longtime fans of the channel may have noticed that I haven't reviewed a lot of strategy or role-playing games so far, and a lot of that is just a practical decision, as those types of games require a lot more time to get a good feel for, and properly craft a review, rather than that quick and dirty review style that I complained about in the introduction. As a result, I have to really want to play one of these titles to do a review, just due to that extra time and dedication required to do the review correctly. And at the time, the concept of Aerobiz had really piqued my interest. Thankfully, Aerobiz turned into one of those games that I not only wanted to play to get the review done, but that I actually wanted to play just to play, and quickly became one of those games where you're telling yourself, oh, just one more turn and I'll go to sleep. But what about Aerobiz Supersonic? I've already alluded to the game having more features than the original Aerobiz, with the existence of 2 more scenarios, but what about the rest of the game? Well, the short version is, if you enjoy the original Aerobiz, then you'll want to play this, as Aerobiz Supersonic essentially takes the original game and expands and tweaks things just like you would expect in a proper sequel. The amount of cities that you can fly between has been quadrupled, the world has now been broken into 7 distinct regions, there's more planes to potentially decide between outfitting your fleet with, and as I mentioned before, the number of scenarios that you play through now has been doubled from 2 to 4, giving you that much more replay value. About the only drawback I could see is that the underlying game is very similar in structure to the original Aerobiz, and I'm sure that there's some people out there that might complain with, I've already played this, why am I playing it again? And I can see where they're coming from. But at the same time, when you have something that's already good and works, and then you simply build out and expand upon it without changing its core features, I've got a hard time complaining about that. Since Aerobiz Supersonic is a sequel to a previous game, you might be asking if it's necessary to play the original Aerobiz to enjoy Aerobiz Supersonic, and I would say not at all. While having played Aerobiz will get you familiar with the idea behind Aerobiz Supersonic, and some of the gameplay and strategies that are used in that game, you can easily pick all that up just from playing this game. I would just say that having played Aerobiz previously might just give you an appreciation for how some things have been tweaked, and how the gameplay has been expanded, as it now feels like a deeper sim. So let's get into Aerobiz Supersonic itself. How exactly does an airline simulator work, you may ask? Well, you control one of 4 airlines that are competing for dominance of the friendly skies. The other 3 airlines can either be controlled by other players or controlled by the computer. After you determine who is competing, you then have the option to pick an era of flight, 1955 to 1975, 1970 to 1990, 1985 to 2005, and finally the completely futuristic, for the time, 2000 to 2020. It's a little weird to think that one of the scenarios that formerly was designed to represent a fictional time period is now completely in the past, but I guess that's what happens when you review video games from 27 years ago. The time periods are important for a few reasons, the first of which being that each 20-year time period acts as a time limit for the game. The game is turn-based, and every turn of the game represents a quarter of the year, so effectively, no game can run longer than 80 turns. Then there's the planes. Aerobiz Supersonic includes real models of planes, or maybe more appropriately jets, from 10 different manufacturers around the world. Part of your job as running your airline is deciding on which planes to buy for your fleet, and depending on which time period the game takes place in, only certain planes will be available to you. Finally, the time periods in the game accurately reflect major historical events within the world, such as things like the Olympics, or bad things like wars. So, depending on when your game is taking place, flying to certain cities may be a boon for your airline sales, or if you're heavily invested in a certain area and something bad happens, things could potentially be more difficult for you. I really like the historical accuracy of the game, whether it's referring to the planes or what's going on around you, with certain cities changing and growing just like they have in real life. It was a bit crazy to start out in the 1955 to 1975 scenario and see the city with the currently busiest airport in the United States, Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, Georgia, be represented in-game with reportedly only having a population of 200,000. And then I remembered, oh yeah, things were a lot different in 1955. And only having certain planes be available in that scenario specifically, because more advanced jets hadn't been invented yet, creates the need to design strategies around those planes. For instance, starting off in one of those scenarios in Chicago as your home hub in the North American region might seem like a good idea, with Chicago being central to the region, and it being a convenient location for inter-region flights to take place. But with the Lockheed L-1049 only having a reach of 4,750 miles in the beginning of the scenario, you're going to have to come up with a different plan if you want to expand your airline reach to Asia. Just a quick aside, while it might not be as impressive as a racing game having real models of cars, or a sports game having real teams and players, I quite enjoy the attention to detail of having real models of planes included in the game that are modeled after their real-life counterparts. It, along with the geographic and historical accuracy of the game, goes a long way to making you feel like you're really there, having to deal with the oil crisis in the 1970s or the various Mideastern wars while still competing for those passengers and, more importantly, their dollars. The bulk of the game consists strategically trying to put together the best selection of routes for your planes, allowing you to expand worldwide while trying to make the best use of your jet fleet economically. For instance, while you can certainly load up on 747s and use them to fly short hops like New York City to Washington, D.C., it's probably not in your best interest long term. Remember, it's not just enough to set up flights between random cities, you need to make money too in your competition with the other airlines. Speaking of that competition, Aerobiz Supersonic offers 5 different difficulty levels to compete in, with all but the last 2 having more stringent wind conditions. Regardless of the difficulty, your goal is to have the highest number of passengers in a certain number of regions, expand your airline's reach to have hubs in each of the 7 regions, and finally, and most importantly, be profitable. On your way to that goal, it's okay to be in the red occasionally, but fail to make a profit for a calendar year, or don't complete your expansion goal in the 20-year limit, and it's back to the drawing board for you. I really appreciate Koei including the easier difficulty levels in the game, as they make the game much more fun and accessible at those lower levels, as you aren't having to drive yourself crazy with every little choice, and can apply more of a, let's see what happens if I do this philosophy towards the gameplay. As far as that gameplay goes, especially if you've never played the original Aerobiz, you may be scratching your head a bit at the beginning trying to figure out what to do. Unfortunately, the main game menu isn't the most intuitive, so you'll probably be referencing the manual a good bit for those first few turns. However, once you play a few rounds, you quickly learn that the game isn't that complicated to get into, and the deepness comes from things like which and how many planes should I buy, what cities should I negotiate flying to, and which businesses should I invest in to drive more customers to fly on my airline. This can become quite addictive, and it's very easy for time to slip away from you as you keep telling yourself, just one more turn, as you strive for global domination. From a graphics and sound perspective, well, it's a sim. No one should be expecting lightning force here. Some graphics have been brought over from the original Aerobiz if you look closely, but ultimately the sequel has been improved, and it does look slightly better, with additional touches here and there, and a much better looking world map to coincide with the expanded gameplay. No one's ever going to play Aerobiz Supersonic for the graphics, but they're not bad, and they complement the game well, which is about all you can ask for a sim. The music in the game is well done as well, with different areas of the globe getting different theme songs as you plot and scheme. The North American one stuck with me though, because it clearly lifts one of the main riffs from Eric Clapton's Tears in Heaven, which seems like an incredibly odd choice for a game about air travel. It doesn't sound bad, mind you, and I suppose if you weren't familiar with the song you'd never know, but lifting a bit from a ballad dedicated to a child who died from falling out a window, in a game where you're trying to prevent planes from crashing out of the sky, is a bit weird to say the least. I'm just going to chalk that up to cultural ignorance with the Japanese programmers and move on, as the rest of the music in game sounds well written and orchestrated. I even thought when playing it that the music sounded more reminiscent of the PCM sound that you would have heard on the Super Nintendo version, so clearly Koei did a solid job of using good quality FM samples when creating the soundtrack. I can imagine that there's going to be some people out there that are going to take one look at the game and think, why the hell should I play that? It looks like math homework. Give me something to shoot. And that's fair. Strategy and sim games are certainly not for everyone, and usually that includes me. But Aerobiz Supersonic, just like Aerobiz before it, managed to suck me in with its addictive gameplay, and for those that give it a chance, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. As a result, just like Aerobiz before it, I'm giving Aerobiz Supersonic 3 stars. I thought long and hard about whether this was a 4-star game, because it is improved in almost every conceivable way from the original Aerobiz, but I ended up sticking with 3 just because even though I think it's great, the reality is this style of game just isn't going to be for everyone. Okay, that was Aerobiz Supersonic for the Genesis, and I've got to say, it was nice to actually play a good game for the first time in a few weeks. I know that's just how things go, and there's going to be some rough patches when reviewing the games from these libraries, but man, going from Clacks and Reggie Jackson Baseball on the Master System to this is a huge step up. As I mentioned earlier, this can be a hard-to-find game on the resale market, but if you're interested in series at all, I highly recommend figuring out a way to spend at least an hour with this, and there's a good chance it's going to turn into 3 or 5 or 12. Tune in next week, as I actually don't have anything pre-scheduled for the first time in a few months, it feels like. For whatever reason, it's just been sequel and series palooza around here recently, so I'm kind of excited to be able to pick out anything I want. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I know what I'm going to do. Next week's game will be a first for the season from both the console it's on and the genre of the game. I hope you like unshaded polygons! Please think about subscribing if you're so inclined, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!